The first thing to establish is just how dangerous and expensive collisions with large animals are.
Imagine this. You're on a road late at night in a rural area, and you see the road is moving. I don't have to imagine it, because that's what happened to me in Oklahoma. Oklahoma, for those who don't know, is like the Australia of the United States. There are snakes that fall out of trees like drop bears. There's giant tarantulas. So I was a little nervous. It looked like a snowdrift covering the road, but it was in the middle of summer, so I knew something else was happening. I pulled over the car, I got out, and I looked behind me. And in the morbid glow of red taillights, I could see this line stretching out behind the vehicle where my tire marks had been. And it was entirely made up of tiny, squished frogs. Scientists call this a mass squishing. It was a frog migration that they'd all decided to cross the road at the same time. Quite tragic. I feel bad. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Welcome back to Infrastructure Connections, the podcast where we explore what makes sustainable infrastructure work, brought to you by the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. I'm your host, Seth Scott, and today we'll be talking to Ben Goldfarb. Ben is an independent conservation journalist. He's the author of Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. The New York Times named it one of the best books of 2023, and I have to agree after having read it. He writes for National Geographic, The Atlantic, The Guardian, and many more publications. He joins us from Colorado. Hi, Ben. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me.
So what is it about writing about nature that inspires you?
You know, I've always loved wildlife and ecology and just being in the outdoors. I grew up fishing, especially. I spent a lot of time around rivers and lakes and streams and ponds, which became a gateway to hiking and backpacking and bird watching and just coming to care about all creatures, all nature. And so these days I write about ecology, about conservation biology, and increasingly about the impacts of infrastructure on the ecosystems and wildlife that I care about.
So you wrote the book Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. What is road ecology and how widespread is it?
I would describe road ecology as a relatively small but very fast-growing field of science that looks at all of the different ways that roads and really all transportation networks and systems interact with nature. I would say that road ecology really starts in a lot of ways with, the most conspicuous or obvious interaction, which is that road kill, right? The dead animal by the side of the highway. But road ecologists increasingly work on other maybe subtler impacts of roads on nature as well, from habitat fragmentation, the barrier effect, the fact that animals can't cross busy roads to complete their migrations or find mates, to the impacts of tire particles on fish populations, to the effects that road noise pollution has on songbird migrations. So roads have this really vast and in some cases I would say surprising or unexpected series of relationships with nature, and road ecologists are interested in investigating those relationships, and I think really importantly, figuring out how we mitigate and manage them, how we solve the problems that roads create for nature. So in that sense, it's a really applied science.
Well, I read the book while I was on a road trip, and there was something very meta about reading about roads while riding in a car on a road. What inspired you to write the book in the first place after your book on beavers?
Yeah, that's funny. I get that reaction a lot from people, especially people who listen to the audiobook while they're driving around, and they're always like, "Yeah, you ruined my road trip. I was having this totally lovely time, and then I listened to your book, and I couldn't stop noticing dead deer." So that's a pretty common experience. I would say that this book really emerged in a lot of ways. In 2013, I was in Montana writing a series of articles about habitat fragmentation and about the fact that, of course, animals, especially large animals like the ones who inhabit the northern Rockies in the US, animals like grizzly bears and elk and wolves and wolverines. They need to walk long distances to survive, to find mates and food and all of the things that all organisms need. And of course, walking long distances in the US, the country with the world's largest road network, generally entails crossing highways. In the course of writing these articles about habitat fragmentation and the need for connectivity between these different environments, I had the chance to take a tour of some wildlife crossings, an overpass and some underpasses on Highway 93 in Montana that had been built on the Flathead Reservation, the land of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, who basically insisted that the government include these crossings when they rebuilt the highway, so that the animals that the tribes cared about could safely move back and forth over and under this highway. And it was just this incredibly inspiring experience for me to see these wildlife crossings and actually get to stand on top of this overpass. We do so much on this planet to make animals' lives harder and more dangerous. And, here was this multi-million-dollar piece of infrastructure we'd built to make their lives safer and easier. And I found something really beautiful in that. And I was also inspired by the intellectual challenge of road ecology and of wildlife crossings, right? To build a wildlife crossing that gets used by a mule deer or a black bear or a bobcat. You have to be able to think like those animals to some extent, to put yourself in the hooves or the paws of other species and, try to imagine how they experience the human-built world.
We all have those stories. You can't drive for very long without actually hitting an animal or some kind of creature. And so, in fact, there was one rabbit fatality on that road trip that I was talking about. I guess when we drive, we justify it to ourselves and we say, it's just one rabbit. There's thousands out there.
Yeah, I think that's an important point too, that I do think we have this way, maybe sometimes subconsciously, of understating roadkill's conservation impact, right? Because as you say, just probabilistically, the animals who are killed most frequently are the most common animals, right? So here in the US, you see lots of dead squirrels and raccoons and white-tailed deer. And, I think we kind of say maybe subconsciously, well, it's sad. Lots of squirrels are being killed. That's a bummer for those individual squirrels. But, there are millions of squirrels out there, right? But, actually there are dozens of threatened and endangered species here in the U.S. and I would say certainly hundreds worldwide, where roadkill is the primary source of mortality. Right? Take Florida panthers or ocelots or Hawaiian geese. All of these again, endangered species, that are largely threatened by roadkill. Florida panthers being a good example. There are a couple hundred Florida panthers out there, and road mortality is at least 20% of panther mortality every year. It's the leading source, and as you say, roadkill is just kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Your book had a great quote, which I'm going to read. It's, "Cars hijacked their victims' own biology, subverting evolutionary history and rendering it maladaptive." You talked about how animals have poor defenses against cars because they weren't biologically designed to deal with cars in the first place. So talk about how most animals seem to have a stand your ground or proximity approach towards danger, which just doesn't work with fast-moving vehicles.
Yeah, certainly. One of the animals that I always think about are turtles, right? Turtles being, one of the unfortunately really obvious or iconic roadkill victims. Animals that we're really driving to extinction in many cases. Both here in the U.S. and certainly in other countries as well, including Australia. And the reason for that obviously is that turtles have this brilliant stand your ground defense mechanism, which is the shell, right? And the shell was incredibly effective for hundreds of millions of years. Of course, turtles are organisms, that predate the dinosaurs. And if your predator is, here in the U.S., a wolf or a coyote or a mountain lion, right? withdrawing your head and limbs into your shell is a really effective strategy for survival. The problem is that when your predator is, a Ford F-250 truck barreling down the highway at 80 miles an hour, the worst possible thing you can do is withdraw into your shell, right? And you get crushed. And so we see these catastrophic turtle mortality events along many American highways. You can name a million animals who basically have evolved to kind of stand their ground, and that's again the worst thing you can do in the face of a vehicle, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you said birds judge the distance between themselves and the threat, and of course, a car traveling fast enough, they don't have time to fly away when they realize that distance has been passed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's of course like the car is just so much faster than anything most organisms would have encountered in their evolutionary history. Right? There's no way of really comprehending an 80-mile-an-hour vehicle. When your habitual predator is a fox that doesn't move more than, let's say, 20 miles an hour.
I was driving in South Australia, and the roadkill there was so bad it was about one kangaroo per kilometer. They were practically kilometer markers. They were so frequent on the side of the road. In your book, you talked about gap acceptance, which deer follow, which is where they have to have a certain amount of distance between two threats before they'll bother to cross the road. Deer, that could be 30 to 60 seconds, whereas humans, it's 5 seconds.
Yeah, and that's I'm glad you mentioned that gap acceptance work, because I think it's really important work. And that was a scientist named 𝗪𝗏 who basically filmed roadsides in Wyoming and just watched deer interact with cars and figured out exactly what you said, which is that it really takes a minute or more for deer to feel totally comfortable safely crossing highways, and a car every minute is an incredibly lightly trafficked highway, right? The vast majority of highways globally, are much more trafficked than that. And so, that really tells us that, again, there's this huge barrier effect problem, this fragmentation problem, right? That it's not just roadkill. It's the fact that, as you say, deer who are frustrated time and again in trying to cross the road eventually give up. And we see in some cases, starvation rates of 40% in some deer herds in winter because they can't cross highways to get to that really good kind of low elevation, snow-free winter range. And so the only way to get animals safely across the road is basically to create this physically separated track for them, right? Again, an overpass, a bridge, essentially, or an underpass, a tunnel, essentially. We have to separate them from the surface of the physical road itself.
And what I thought was interesting was it isn't just the road itself or the danger of the road itself. It's the road noise that can last up to 3 miles away to deter wildlife.
So there's this great experiment called the Phantom Road Experiment that was conducted in the state of Idaho by these researchers at Boise State University. And basically what they did was they audio recorded traffic, and then they played that traffic recording through speakers in an unroaded part of the forest. So you're just, you're stripping out the single variable. You're isolating the variable of noise. There's no road present. There are no vehicles present. All there is the noise of the road. And what they found very clearly was that migratory songbirds generally avoided that area where they were playing the road noise through speakers. And I think really tellingly, those birds who did still hang out in that vicinity actually had they were in worse body condition. They gained less weight. And that's basically because, if you're a little songbird, you have to constantly listen for your predators, right? The flap of a hawk's wings or, a bobcat creeping through the underbrush. But if you if you can't hear your predators because those subtle acoustic signals are drowned out by road noise, you have to look around for your predators instead. And every second you're looking is a second that you're not feeding, right? And so you don't gain as much weight, and that potentially makes you less fit to complete your migration. And so in that sense, road noise is this, again, kind of subtle, non-lethal, or at least non-directly lethal impact of the road that can, nevertheless really add up and have these population level consequences.
This all sounds horrific. So let's talk about the solutions, because that was a big part of the book as well. And in sustainability, we find it useful to translate some of the sustainability initiatives like carbon into dollar values, which is something that most people can understand a little bit more clearly. And road ecologists were successful by doing the same thing, using a cost-benefit analysis to determine the value of animal crossings to society. Tell us about how they came up with that and how successful that's been.
Certainly, yeah. I think that, look, the first thing to establish is just how dangerous and expensive collisions with large animals are, right? If you hit a deer here in the U.S., the average deer collision costs society more than $9 million in hospital bills, vehicle repairs, insurance costs, tow trucks, on and on. Hundreds of drivers are killed every year. These are really dangerous collisions as well. And certainly nobody in Australia wants to hit a kangaroo either, right? That's a large animal that can mess your car up as well. I'm not sure if the costs of kangaroo collisions have ever been quantified, but I bet they're pretty steep, right? So if you can build infrastructure that prevents many of these collisions every year as wildlife crossings and fences along the road, which keep the animals off the highway and kind of direct the animals to the crossings. Those wildlife crossings and fences, in many, many cases, prevent a number of collisions annually, and thus recoup their own construction costs pretty quickly. There have been, plenty of published case studies out there of wildlife crossings, even multi-million-dollar networks of crossings and fences, paying for themselves in a decade or two. Certainly much faster than their design life, which I think is typically considered around 75 years. So there's always a little bit of sticker shock, within transportation agencies and the public when you talk about the costs of these projects, right? These days, the average wildlife overpass, here in the U.S. is probably going to start at $10 million, and the average underpass is, certainly $1 million or up. So that sounds like a lot, right? We're going to spend millions of dollars helping antelope cross a highway. That's kind of crazy. It seems frivolous, but when you really do the math, these projects are actually incredibly thrifty.
So what kind of animal crossings are you seeing built? What are some of the varieties that you've seen around the world for different kinds of animals? The
underpass is sort of like the standard thing, right? You can imagine a big box culvert or kind of a stream crossing. Any animal that's walking along that stream, can basically follow that water course under the roadway. There's this really amazing diversity here in the U.S. and Australia has these as well. We've got overpasses, right? Effectively a bridge, and then the other really cool trend that we see in Australia and a number of tropical countries are these canopy crossings in places with arboreal animals, like squirrel gliders are kind of the famous Australian case study where you've got these little arboreal marsupials and their territories are split by highways. The challenge for them is that they're not going to descend to the forest floor to use a conventional underpass, right? So you really have to reconnect their isolated arboreal habitats at the level of the treetop. And so, you see these networks of rope ladders of bridges, essentially rope bridges. And in some cases, what they call glider poles. So the gliders can actually glide from pole to pole across the highway. And now you see these sorts of canopy crossings for primates in Brazil and sloths in Costa Rica and really, all over the tropics. tropics. So again, just thinking about the unique ecology and biology and habitat requirements of whatever species you're mitigating for is so important.
Well, that's one of the things I found fascinating is we often think of roads as a horizontal barrier to animals when we think of it at all, but it's also a vertical barrier to animals. So even birds have to worry about roadkill.
Yeah, definitely. Look, bird collisions are a huge unsung problem. Hundreds of millions of birds, get killed by cars every year. I would say globally, it's really behind only cats and window strikes as a cause of bird mortality. So it's a huge problem and a really tough one to solve. But there are solutions, and as you alluded to, right, just creating some kind of barrier that forces birds to fly over traffic rather than through traffic can be really helpful. There's a case study that I mentioned in the book as well, along similar lines. This causeway, over the ocean, essentially this, kind of elevated causeway in Florida, and all of these terns and I think pelicans were getting hit by cars as they flew kind of across this causeway, and they basically added a bunch of poles, vertical poles to the causeway, just to create this kind of visual obstruction that forced birds to fly over traffic rather than through it, and that dramatically reduced tern collisions. So again, bird collisions, insect collisions, all of these these flying animals, tougher to mitigate than the mammals for sure, but we've got some options.
It's amazing that the solution could be that simple, just putting up some poles and then that's enough to deter them. It was interesting. You described cars as super predators. It's an amazing way to think of it when you're just on your Sunday drive. You're actually the super predator on the ecology ladder.
If you think about a natural ecosystem, a natural population. Let's imagine a herd of deer and a pack of wolves. Those wolves are taking out the least fit members of the population, right? They're targeting, the older, sicker animals, or maybe the younger ones, who haven't yet become, breeding adults, right? So those wolves are kind of weeding out the sick and the old and the young, but they're really generally not targeting the most fit adult breeding animals who are so important for the maintenance of that deer population, right? Whereas roadkill is this totally indiscriminate predator. An 18-wheeled semi-truck doesn't care whether you're a demographically important adult female breeder. It doesn't care if you're young or old or healthy or sick. It's just totally indiscriminate. And I think in that sense, it's hugely problematic because it's taking out, not just the old sick individuals like a natural predator would, but also the healthy ones, the breeding females, especially. You see that. I've mentioned turtles, but turtles are another great example of that, where oftentimes it's the female turtles who are getting hit because those are the ones who are venturing out onto land, to lay their eggs and have to cross roads in the process. And so we see this dramatic skewed sex ratio where lots of the reproductively important females are being killed. And so you might look at a pond and see a few turtles in there, but those are the males who have survived. Meanwhile, the females are unfortunately flattened and the population has no future. And so the ways in which roadkill is this, again, totally undiscerning predator that takes out the animals that populations need the most. I think that's really pernicious.
But those turtles, being males, are functionally extinct. And even if there's enough of them to breed for a while, they're still functionally extinct. And that's kind of frightening. One of the most frightening terms in your book, I felt, was the word the 𝗪𝗵𝘁. We've all heard about the Anthropocene, where we can see in geological time the impact of human beings on this planet with plastics and oil. But the 𝗪𝗵𝘁 is that age of loneliness that we'll have to live through as we are increasingly the last species on the planet. And I find that haunting. I actually do see it when I go snorkeling. I don't see many fish. I don't see many plants. It just seems like a desert out there. I see it when I go into the forest, and even though I'm in a forest, it's a forest of pines planted by humans, and there's no bird song because there's no birds in the forest. It's quite terrifying. How do you see that? You're out in nature all the time, and you write about nature. How does that kind of guide what your thoughts are while you're out there?
Yeah, that's a sad but really poignant question, and I think it is a really important point, right? And it's a term coined by of course the famous biologist E.O. Wilson, and I think one of the things that it captures is that it's not just extinction, right? I think that the bigger problem, and certainly the problem that changes our experience of the world more dramatically, is defaunation, as some people have put it, or biological annihilation. The fact that even formerly common animals are becoming rarer and rarer. I like you, I feel like, I think about like some of the ponds that I grew up, fishing at and catching frogs and salamanders and turtles at, and they were these places that were teeming with life, with snapping turtles and leopard frogs and spotted salamanders, right? And now they're just kind of dead, and those species aren't going to become extinct anytime soon, right? There are lots of snapping turtles out there. They're not an extinction level threat, but they're just much less abundant on the landscape they were, and they're much less part of our daily lives. And I think that's what that term really gets at, is that there's this, along with biological extinction, there's this extinction of experience that we're all suffering through, that we're just in much less contact with wildlife and nature than we ever were. And, and part of that is that we're, increasingly indoor animals and screen addicted animals. But, part of it is also that so many of the common creatures that surrounded us are ever rarer.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that road ecology doesn't just study flora and fauna, it also studies the road's impact on humans as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? For example, the noise pollution and how it affects us?
One of the things I tried to do in the book was draw some of those parallels, because I do think that road ecologists, they do tend to be fairly focused on wildlife and quote unquote natural ecosystems. And meanwhile, there's this whole other a series of parallel fields, like pedestrian science, that look at infrastructure's impacts on humans. And in my book, I really tried to draw some of those parallels and encourage those disparate communities to interact more, because in some respects they're really studying the same thing, right? I mean, the fragmentation of ecosystems, in road ecology, and the fragmentation of human communities, is increasingly a concern of urbanists and planners.
It makes sense. Humans are natural creatures and we're part of nature. And so we're also getting run down by cars, and we're also impacted in many of the same ways. Well, I really appreciated having you on the show. It was fantastic, so informative. And I think I'm definitely recommending your book to as many people as I can. I hope the listeners also check out the book. There's a lot more information in there than what we covered here. So yeah, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks a lot for having me. That was great.
And thank you for listening to another episode of Infrastructure Connections. Please take a moment to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and we'd like to hear from who you'd like to listen to. So please let us know down in the comments who you'd like us to interview next. Until then, stay tuned for the next episode of Infrastructure Connections.